Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another Roll20 review, my written and video review series. Take a look at the marketplace section of online role-playing website, roll20.net. This video will be reviewing the D&D 5e adventure, The Wild Beyond the Witchlight, designed by Wizards of the Coast and adapted by Roll20. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Guess what? We finally got our Feywild adventure. I've been reviewing countless DM's Guild modules over the years and have seen lots of different Fey-based adventures and always commented the fact that we've never actually gotten a full 5e campaign book based on the Feywild. And now it is here. I ultimately have mixed feelings about it. It does focus very heavily on the story, on the characters, on the setting. In many ways, it draws from very classic fairy tales. Now, before you roll your eyes at it, keep in mind, a lot of times when we think of fairy tales, we think of like kiddified versions and, Disney taking, classic stories and making them family-friendly musicals and stuff. Really, if you think about it, fairy tales are like the original horror stories, right? It's like curses and people dying tragically and really messed up scary stuff happening. Like it's honestly kind of just it's all very supernatural and unsettling in very interesting ways, and I think makes for very rich storytelling for D&D, which is good. And I think it doubles down on all that, and that makes it a worthwhile adventure, with the caveat that I think it leans a little too hard in that direction, because yes, you can in fact play this entire adventure without actually even getting into combat, which that's a tricky sell, I think, for D&D, because at the end of the day, D&D is mostly a combat simulator with, some RPG stuff tacked on there, if we really want to get frank about it. So I prefer a balance. I really like a nice balance between exploration, role-playing, and combat, the three pillars of D&D. And I actually think this one leans a little too hard away from combat, even though there is certainly some avenues to do that. In fact, I think it would be very hard to avoid combat completely in this adventure. The other thing that has me have mixed feelings about it is, while it does a very good job of exploring Tier 1 and like Tier 1.5, it's over after that. This is a level 1 through 8 adventure, and I've already get annoyed by Wizards of the Coast having adventures that are, levels 1 through 11 and just kind of disregard the higher levels of play, because it's like them tacitly acknowledging that even those higher levels are just kind of crazy bullshit in terms of trying to even do content for them. But I at least want them to try. And now I feel like we're going even worse in this direction, where it's like, no, we're still going to double down on these early level stuff, because that's where the best D&D content and the most meaningful adventures can take place. So it feels like it lacks content compared to, this is the same price as Storm King's Thunder, as Curse of Strahd, as Prince of the Apocalypse, as Tomb of Annihilation. And yet I feel like this, even though there may be enough content here, because it does have some mega, and I promise you I'm going to get into the weeds in a second. I just want to give this kind of at the beginning, but it just feels like, because the scope ends so early, it does feel like it's lacking in that overarching story. I don't feel like I really go on a nice big, hero's journey in this adventure, and it makes it feel like it's only like half a campaign, whereas the other ones, the other ones really feel like half a campaign, because you end at 11 or 12, and your character is just now starting to be like, all right, now I can really take on the cool shit, and then the campaign's over. This one, you don't even get to that point yet, so that kind of makes it feel lacking. But the production quality is very good. We do get some really nice looking maps. I do think the setting is very, very cool. And like I said, it really doubles down on that fantastical, supernatural, fish out of water storytelling. And I think back to classic stories like Wizard of Oz is very heavily influenced from in this adventure. In fact, you literally get companions like a fucking scarecrow and an animated tin can. Alice in Wonderland obviously is probably one of the most classic, fish out of water. I think of the 80s movie Labyrinth with David Bowie and Jennifer Connelly as being somebody sucked into a fantastical realm and, meets all these friends and stuff. Peter Pan, Neverland, obviously a very big setting that can be drawn from for the Fae. These are all, if you like those kind of stories and those kind of adventures, then I think you're going to really, really like this one, and I think it does a decent job of applying that to the D&D mechanics. Again, you know, obviously any DM can make that work. But we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about the story and stuff. And specifically, I'm also going to talk about how it is adapted to Roll20 and what it looks like in Roll20. So, first of all, what is included in the Wild Beyond the Witchlight Roll20 bundle, which, as I mentioned, is priced at the same as all the other big ticket 5e campaign adventures. You get the module, which is, I was going to say a full campaign, but again, levels 1 through 8. It includes 5 chapters, 5 non-gridded region or area maps, which the maps are very, very cool. I'll show you in a second. Some of my favorite region maps, actually. 5 10-foot grid maps with subdivisions. That's kind of a bummer. I'll show you what that looks like, but we all know D&D doesn't really work on a map scale unless you're using 5-foot square maps, so I hate the fact that we continue to see these years after 5e has been out yet. 1 5-foot scale battle map. Over 70 magic items, including over 20 new items to Wild Beyond the Witchlight. Over 150 NPC and monster character sheets and tokens, including 50 that are new to this campaign, or over 50 that are new to this campaign. Over 50 player art handouts, not including the monster art handouts. Most of those monsters all have handouts that you can show your players. 50 plus rollable tables and macros, and about a dozen relevant supplement handouts from the Dungeon Master's Guide. You also get the Wild Beyond the Witchlight Compendium, which in the case of a lot of the adventures typically just adds whatever a little bit of extra new player facing content was added in the campaign, which in this case was 2 new races. Are we still calling them races? I think they're called races in this one, which are the fairy and the rabbit people, Haringen or something. 2 new backgrounds, and the one notable thing I wrote down was a D100 table of Feywild trinkets. And then a player art pack with 18 tokens, which I can go and show you what that looks like. So I've got it, I think, pulled up here. Yeah. So when you get the player art pack, you go to your art gallery, go to marketplace purchases, and it's basically, it turns a lot of the artwork that's from the book into tokens that you can then slap down, and your players or you can use them, which is always just kind of a nice thing. It just adds new tokens, especially when it comes to like entirely new races like the Haringen and stuff, as well as a few handouts. So that's the only thing it adds. But the main thing is the module, and that's what we're going to look at and talk about. So the story, and yes, this is the one that starts with a carnival. The carnival is very cool. It's designed for level 1, so there's not a whole lot of like, it's not like the evil, grim, dark carnival that you'd probably expect a D&D carnival to be. Instead, it's actually a legit, just fantastical, fun carnival for level 1 characters to kind of putter around in. I thought, thinking back to, was it Neverwinter Nights 2 that you actually started off? Like the prologue was kind of a mini, it wasn't carnival, it was like a fair or something where you had to do some fun little mini games and stuff. That's kind of what it reminded me of. You can go around and do little fun activities, and I'm going to show you that map because it's a really cool map. Actually, first I want to talk about this tip page. I have reviewed a lot of Roll20 campaigns over the years on this channel, and this is the first time I've seen them do this, which is a really cool Dungeon Master's like tips page for basically people who are new to Roll20, and it literally appears as like a map page on here, and it includes a lot of just helpful tips on how do you change maps, how do you bring people to different maps, how does dynamic lighting work if you're using that, how can you test like token vision to make sure everything looks and lines up correctly, how do you use things on the GM layer to then put them on the token layer, stuff that should be second nature if you've been running in Roll20 at all, but not a lot of people are. Sometimes this might be your first, you might be joining Roll20, this might be your first adventure, so this is a really, really cool thing, and frankly there might be people who've been using Roll20 for a while and haven't actually been using these things. I very famously went through, probably years that I've been using a single macro or table, and I'm finally getting on with that program. So this is a really, really cool. It's nothing here is specific to Wild Beyond the Witchlight. It's just all general advice. So I hope they do this going forward for all of their, basically all their content. I mean, it's branded D&D on here, but I'd love to see that going forward. In fact, I'd love to see that retroactively added to the old ones. Probably not like, if you've already purchased it, I don't want to mess up people's maps or anything, but this is a very cool addition, I think, and huge thumbs up for that. The token page, which is included in every single main module you add. So you can either grab tokens 2 ways. You can grab them from the journal on this right-hand side and just grab somebody and drag it over here. And you've already got the hit points, you've got the name tag, and you've got the token set up and the token's ready to go. I can shift double click and instantly pull up this creature. This is an example of a Fey creature, by the way. This is not Sunshine and Rainbows Feywild, folks. This is deadly as shit. The Feywild is dangerous as shit. Pretty messed up. And this is the handout, so you can show your character, show your players this picture without showing the whole character sheet. There's your character sheet. You can click on buttons. I'm going through all this kind of real quickly in case you really haven't seen any of the Roll20 stuff. It starts out defaulting whispers to the GM only and gives you both rolls in case you've got advantage. If you're like me, you're going to turn off whisper and make advantage a toggle. And that way all that stuff is going to be posted. I rolled a crit. Look at that. Posted publicly. And in fact, you can actually turn off the auto damage as well. Let's turn that off. Let me get another crit here. Not quite. And then only if it hits do you actually hit the attack button, which I think is a cool little thing to do. So those are the preferences I use. So all of that is set up, but if you wanted to, you can also look at the token page, which shows all the tokens that are used in this campaign, which includes, as I mentioned, over 150. Some of these are, specific new stuff that was added in Wild Beyond the Witchlight, but a lot of it is just stuff, Fire Elemental, Flame Skull, stuff you've been seeing from years and years of D&D. And you can just take this, Control C and Control V, and that way you can just pop those creatures out as you need to. So all of that is included. All of that is extremely convenient. Obviously, a huge reason why you're getting the module in Roll20 for sure. So let's take a minute to talk about the actual story and the maps and stuff. By the way, I didn't realize this, but this is actually tied to a previous book that was released not too long ago called Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Specifically, one of the dark domains is the Carnival, and it's literally just called the Carnival. And the people who used to run this dark carnival, which were a bunch of Shatterkai elves named Mr. Witch and Mr. Light, crossed paths with another person who was running was a Ladrin who was running the more light-themed carnival, the happier carnival, and they decided to switch owners and run each other's carnivals. So you end up with the kind of dark, evil-looking circus owners, I guess, carnival owners, running the happy-go-lucky carnival, and that's really the only real tie-in. There's some notes about, Isolde, the carnival's owners, a pair of Shatterkai elves. So that's just a funny, almost an Easter egg. If you've been reading Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, it turns out this little section of the carnival one of this domain was going to lead into an entire new campaign book for 5e. So I got the reference. I remembered all that happened. Just now you know as well. This is a really, really fun map. In fact, I really like this map and the map of Prismeer, which is the actual Feywild domain that you end up going to. This reminds me of those old school video game maps that you would fold out, and they've got the cool banners on the edge and the cloth maps. It's a really fun map to look at. It's got little trackers on the corner for time and for the mood of the carnival, which matters a little bit, not really too much. There's not a whole lot of main events going on, but there's a few things. The story can start in one of two ways. You can either do an interesting backstory with the characters to pull them into the plot, which is you visited here as children. Apparently this place only comes around once every 8 years. And you all lost something here. You had a spooky encounter. I'm almost picturing Jordan Peele's Us, with the mirror thing. In fact, the doorway to the Feywild is through the freaking Hall of Mirrors or Hall of Illusions. You have that encounter, you lose something, and that sticks with you, and it just fucks up your whole childhood. And then you come back, when it's come back to the material plane, and you're seeking answers for that. And it turns out it's been stolen and drawn into the Feywild, and that kind of brings you down into that, proverbial rabbit hole, basically. And that ties you into a little bit and gives you a personal connection to the fact that all these hags, which have taken over the Feywild, have been stolen all of your childhood treasures and screwed everything up for you. That's an interesting way to do it and adds more of a story fairy tale feel to it. But if you don't want to do that, you could just run it as a more traditional D&D adventure. So I could actually pull up is that under beginning the adventure? And you could pull, so Lost Things is the one I just described. The other one is just called Warlock's Quest, which is essentially just a random quest-giving NPC who is a warlock, and his archfey is the, what's her name? Zybilna, I believe, is the Feywild queen domain of her queen of her domain. And he knows that he can't feel that connection to his archfey, and he basically sends you on a mission to go rescue her. So he knows there's a portal to that domain in the carnival somewhere. So your whole goal is just to find that, get to her, and rescue her. So what's interesting is you actually don't really get what the main plot is in the first story. You're just kind of drawn here because of some mysterious circumstances, and you end up going through the story, and it's a little bit more of effective storytelling. Whereas the second one, that's more of a traditional D&D, like, hey, here's the quest, go here and do the thing, ends up spoiling a lot of the information, which is, yes, the fairy, the Feywild queen is in trouble, and then her realm has been carved up by a bunch of hags who's like frozen her in time. You don't necessarily know all that right away, but you know, like, your goal is to find this portal in the carnival, whereas otherwise the other starting adventure you really don't know, and it's much more I think a little bit more interesting to just kind of explore things on your own pace. But it's a really fun carnival. There's a traveling piano operated by a mind-swapped monkey. There's a really fun word puzzle at the carousel where you can match names of the horses that are all like proverbs, like fortune favors the bold, or pride before the fall, and they have like words, missing, and there's little puzzle things to do there. There's of course all these different people to talk to. There's a mime who's fallen in love with a merfolk, and he's lost his voice because this Kenku stole it, and she's just going around being a pain in the ass to everybody because she knows that she kind of has the same Warlock Archfey problem where her patron has been, she can't feel the connection anymore, and she knows it's something to do with this carnival. The upsetting thing is, as cool as this carnival is, and I like it a lot, there's a lot of really fun things. There's snail rides that are set up like the dinosaur rides in Tomb of Annihilation. Like, they really pull together a lot of the fun, like, minigame concept of you going around and just having fun. And I think if there's a opportunity to let players just go nuts and have fun doing stuff, I mean, a carnival is just a fucking great idea for it, and it's very thematic for the Feywild. The bummer is, once you enter into the Feywild domain, the carnival really doesn't play any other factor into it. There's a few things where it's like, oh, if they had learned how to, snail race properly, and there's a snail later you might find that kind of gives you advantage there. You can keep track of a few things. There's a story tracker here that you're designed to kind of keep track of the different things that the players did in the carnival, and it's supposed to play into the Feywild a little bit, but I didn't find that particularly satisfying, and I was a little disappointed that Roll20 didn't include this as a separate like map page like they did with I think it was the Tyranny of Dragons one, where they actually had a separate whole map page where you could track via tokens, like, who was following what faction and things. Instead, it's just a regular, like, hey, here's a thing that you can't even actually write in because this is just a handout. So I think it's a really fun carnival. There's a lot of fun stuff going on here. There's opportunities to get into the Feywild, which is you get teleported. There's a heist where you can steal Mr. Witch's watch, good lord, or Mr. Light's cane. And both those things, like magical artifacts that they can't, be parted with, and all have these super serious abilities and things that can't leave the carnival. And different NPCs will help you, do that heist. Or there's just this Deus Ex NPC who can just help you find the area if you really don't find it. And you're ultimately teleported into the Feywild. So it's a really fun level 1 thing. You could almost run this as a one-shot if you just want your players to just have fun and run around and just do shit. I think it's actually a really delightful opening chapter. And really, one of the few, so many D&D campaign adventures just gloss over those early levels and just concentrate sorely on like tier 2, because that's when like the real adventure begins, like specifically like levels 3, 4, and 5. Whereas this one, the level progression is literally you start the carnival at level 1, and then after you finish the carnival, you get to level 2, and then it's pretty slow. It's like you do an entire Fey realm, I think, at one level, and then once you meet the hag, you level up again after that. So when you make it into the next zone, this is Prismeer, and I'm not going to cover every single little thing here because I don't want this video to be super long, but this is also a really fun freaking map. This also reminds me of those old, like, video game maps, like the old Might and Magic maps, where it was all very colorful and kind of stylized, and it just fits the theme and mood very, very well. The storyline here is that a bunch of hags, with the help of a villainous group called the League of Malevolence, were able to essentially use capture a magic artifact that belongs to what's her name, Zybilna of the Feywild, this is her Palace of Heart's Desire, and they freeze her and basically the entire palace in time, and then they carve up her domain into 3 different areas so that each hag sister rules one of the domains. So it almost becomes kind of a Domains of Dread kind of a thing, like a miniature version, and not quite as dark and evil as the actual Ravenloft ones are, but that's kind of the inspiration here. It's similar to that in terms of everything is being run by this hag, and so it's everybody's in bad shape. Basically, everybody you meet is getting screwed by the whatever the reigning hag is because of the way that she's been running things. So you end up going to Hither first. The castle is supposed to be connected to all three. I don't think that shows up on the map very well, but you can see that all three of them technically connect to the castle. However, your main goal in this entire adventure is essentially to make it to the Palace of Heart's Desire and free the queen. That requires a unicorn horn, and they do the thing that they do in Curse of Strahd, where you're supposed to like roll, or you could just choose where this thing is anywhere in the campaign. It's somewhere in one of these three realms, and with that unicorn horn, or there's another unicorn you could technically try to use, and you use that on anybody who's been frozen, and they then unfreeze. Or you could use I think it's a flame tongue or a frost brand that's carried by one of the League of Malevolence people in the actual palace. If really you never found the unicorn horn or anything, you could grab that sword and smash the actual cauldron, and that also frees everybody. So, you know, it very much feels like a fairy tale thing. Everybody's frozen in time, and there's these evil hags running things. There is the Swampland. Let's see, what did I write down? There's Haringen bandits stealing happy memories. There's an inn that crawls around on legs. There's hobgoblins on stilts. Animated armor that can pop out of the swamp, but it just mimics the character's movements. None of these, by the way, are combat encounters. Even the stuff where you're like waylaid by bandits, they're all just very whimsical, and you know, they might taunt you or do something. It does mention in a lot of the adventures that, like, you know, hey, if push comes to shove, then combat will occur, but there is technically a way, if your players play all their cards right, they could actually avoid combat for the most part. So if you wanted a campaign that was very much focused not on combat, this would be a good one. Now, could you run this as a combat-focused campaign? No, I don't think so, because we don't get a whole lot of maps here, and that's the big bummer about how this adapts to Roll20. Essentially, there are no dungeons in any of these domains except for the Hag Layers, which are very cool dungeons, and we'll get to that in a second, and the Palace of Heart's Desire, which is a huge dungeon. So all of these locations you're seeing, Brigand's Fallway, Slanty Tower, Thelmy Hill, Nibs Cave, Wayward Pool, none of those are mapped. They're just given different notes about what's going on there and what you encounter and different things. Little Oak is very much the Neverland Lost Boys. Wayward Pools, where you can meet a unicorn. Slanty Tower, you can free a crashed airship, because the Hag Lair is like a swamp gas balloon factory run by bullywugs. And there's one that tried to escape. It's a little fairy dragon who's got a little sword. He tried to escape. He's in a cage. You can rescue him. There's a lot of really fun events to happen, but none of these are actually like little, dungeon crawls, or meant to be like, hey, you're going room to room, fighting stuff and getting loot, which I think is a very much a classic part of D&D that everybody kind of signs on for. So that's the part where I'm like a little turned off by it, even though I really like all the locations. And what I really like, especially, is the attention to encounters, which I'm trying to remember which section that is. Is it Arrival? There's the inn at the end of the road. So all of them have, here we go. Each one of these zones has a D8 table of encounters. Now it says random encounters, which technically, yes, that's what they are. If they're not like a set destination you're going to, then I guess it's a random encounter on the road. But it's almost a misnomer, because these are all heavily scripted events that happen. Like I said, though, that animated armor that like pops up and just mimics the character's movements, or that inn that has the legs that crawls around and inside just a friendly druid that's got information, or these hobgoblins that are on stilts like collecting eggs from stuff. It's almost like, like in Alice in Wonderland or Labyrinth, where you just look out and you see some crazy thing happening. That's kind of what's going on here. None of these are designed to be combat encounters at all, but they're just really, really fun scripted events, to where none of these are like, hey, it's 1d3 plus 1 orcs, because that stuff's not interesting, even though, it might be fun to like throw a combat encounter at your party occasionally. What I really like are random encounters that actually tie into that location, and they really bring something to the party and the story and all that. And these do a phenomenal job of that. Each one of these 3 locations has 8 very richly themed encounters, to where I was very impressed. I mean, look at these pages and pages of, these are just the encounters. All of this section in the arrivals, there's multiple paragraphs of all of these, and each of these 3 locations has that. So that's a huge thumbs up. The hither is the swamp, thither is a forest domain, and yon is a mountainous domain. And of course, all the hags are, highly thematic. The one in hither is like this frog lady who can like open her mouth wide and swallow you. The one in thither is the classic like kidnapping children and using them to make toys, and so she's got like tin soldier minions and like Rugs of Smothering and Red Caps and stuff. If you're looking for dungeons, the hag layers are actually pretty good dungeons. By the way, what's up with hags? I know Jeremy Crawford loves his fucking hags, but holy crap, man, I've seen so many D&D adventures that use hags. Like every single adventure seemingly has hags as either a BBEG or like one of the main antagonists, or they're just thrown in there randomly, like famously in Rime of the Frost Maiden, slight spoiler for that one. Which I don't think I'll use in my campaign. One of the things at the very end in Ether, and there's just like a portal, and there's a hag coven there. It's like they just can't help but themselves but include hags. I know hags are very fun villains, and at least here it makes sense. Hags are the like eponymous villains of the Fae, right? And that kind of makes, otherwise it's just an evil fairy queen or something. Oh, by the way, we do get some zoomed in maps of each section, so if you're actually there, you can look at these. These are literally just the exact same map, but it's kind of blown up a bit, which is nice. So if you're in that specific section, you can go on here. I think supposedly they've got the mileage on here correctly, so you could technically track that. And then otherwise the names I think are on the GM layer, so you can choose to show them to your players or not by adding them to the token or map layer. But these are not, these are not battle maps, so none of these areas are meant to be dungeons except for the hag layers. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because previously I have complained so much about these D&D adventures in Roll20 that don't use color, they don't use detail, none of that. It's all, like Dragon Heist and Ghost of Saltmarsh. They were all just black and white graph paper maps, and it's so disappointing to see that on Roll20. This is not that, and I am very, very happy to report that we get good-ass looking maps. It's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is the few maps we get are really, really awesome. They're highly thematic dungeons. They've got beautiful full-color designs. They are absolutely incredible. This is probably the worst one just because it's a swamp, and it's hard to make a swamp look good, but it's a cool, if you can picture, you can see a little outline of the house. So there's these clotheslines that like go into this fog where you can kind of barely see the house, and you're supposed to be able to take any of these clotheslines up into the dungeon, which means there's 4 different entrances to this hag's lair, which is really cool. And then, by the way, outside there's all these cool things. You can meet the Scarecrow, who's one of your main allies in this adventure. Basically, there's one NPC in each area that knows the way to get to the next area, so you kind of have to find them. And he's talking to a bunch of heads, and he's missing his poor head. He had to put a gourd on there, but he's got lobster claws as hands, which is really neat. There's like a bullywog knight you can meet over here. She's pretty great. Morgort, look at that picture. They do a great job of doubling down on the eccentric fun characters, which is definitely like very much the Alice in Wonderland thing, where everybody is just insane and nuts and fun. They definitely do that, which I think could be a lot of fun for the right groups that enjoy that. I mean, and I think that's something that translates very well to D&D, is really fun, eccentric, wild characters. It can be very memorable and fun to deal with the players specifically. This particular one is actually a 2-parter, because that cottage is, once you actually get to the cottage, we get a zoomed in map of it, and this is the 1 5-foot square battle map we get, which is pretty cool. There's a gelatinous cylinder down there in this well that kind of eats everything. The actual hags, again, you can make it through without combat, so you could technically just talk to the hag and bargain with her, and she'll give you all these different tasks to perform, and if you do that, then you can work out a deal with them, or you can run them off, and they'll run away to the next layer, the next hag, and then those 2 run to the next hag, and then they'll all run to the palace. They can just keep fleeing. You never have to really destroy them. Again, the whole point of the campaign is just to make it to that final dungeon, and the hags don't block you from doing that. It's just collecting their NPCs from each area that actually bring you to the next area. The one thing you need is the unicorn horn. So it's not quite the Zelda structure of having the different, because it kind of reminded me of that at first, where it was the different domains, and each domain had like the dungeon, because that's the hag's lair, and you go into the dungeon, you defeat the monster, you get the thing, and you can go. In this case, you don't actually have to do that, which is odd. That's one thing I might change if I were to run this, is make sure there's like, each hag is actually a mini boss that you have to defeat or deal with in some way before you can actually make it to, they've got some MacGuffin or something on them. Before you can actually make it to the next layer. So you have to kind of complete one and go to the next one. And that way it's kind of meant to scale a little bit for level. So the first area is level 2, and then maybe the next dungeon is like level 3, and then the next area is 4, and that dungeon might be 5, and then 6, 7, and then the final dungeon might be 7 or 8 or something. That's kind of how it breaks down. But I think these are really cool looking dungeons. They work really well. There's a lot of neat stuff happening in there. The one in Thither is a hollowed out tree, which has a lot of the captured children making nightmare toys, living dolls, tin soldiers, boggles, red caps. Really, really neat looking, and I think they're very highly thematic, and they're just great looking. And I'm after being so disappointed with a lot of the map art in Roll20, I'm so glad. Starting, I think with Rime of the Frostbane, we got really good maps, and now with this one, we got good maps. And I said it was a good news, bad news. The bad news is there's just not a lot of it, right? We only have these 3 hag layer maps, which one of them is kind of a 2-parter because it's got the cottage. But otherwise, it's basically 3 areas: Loom, Lurch, Motherhorn, and Downfall, which are all hag layers, which are all very cool and very thematic. And then we've got the final dungeon, which all these hag layers are very big. They're all like 20 or 30 room dungeons, which I would consider humongous. And then the final dungeon is actually like a 50 room mega behemoth dungeon, which is also really cool. This one, by the way, is the stage. This hag is like all about the theater and putting on performances and stuff. So she's got this cool like mountain cliffside stage, and she's like overlooks it, and there's all these darklings that run everything. There's shadows in the theater. There's 2 factions you can unite in Yawn, which are the Quarids and the Banker Rocks or something. And one of them are little mouse people. Their souls are lights that come up behind them in their exterior, and the other ones look like those little rock trolls from Frozen. And you can basically convince them that the other people aren't bad. It's the hag that's actually need to go kill. And they can kind of rise up and go after the hag. I mean, there's cool stuff going on in all these areas, and I'm very impressed with these dungeons especially. So I think that's a huge plus for this campaign. And then we finally get to the finale. Oh, did I mention the Jabberwock, which is a Alice in Wonderland reference? The Jabberwock does exist. There's a lot of cool teases for it. Is it like crunching around and being dangerous? It's really messed up looking. I'm going to show it to you. It looks like a fucking messed up like zombie dragon. Look at that. That's very cool. And this thing is crazy powerful. And essentially, this is basically the boss of the campaign. But you can deal with it non-violently. You can just free, when you go into the palace, you can free this giant fucking owl named Bloody Beak, who's been frozen, so you have to use the unicorn horn on her. And that owl will just go after this fucking Jabberwock, and then they'll just chase it away. And then you can go up and tap the Fairy Queen and be on your way. So you don't have to actually complete the final boss fight. So everything that you encounter has other ways of dealing with it, which I think is good game design. I really do. I think that's really fun game design if you include multiple paths for the players to deal with everything. That being said, I wish we had some more dungeons to crawl in. Just give me. We've had so much of that. We've had entire campaign adventures that were nothing but dungeon crawls. Prince of the Apocalypse was basically just a 13-room mega dungeon. Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage is literally just 20 fucking dungeons stacked on top of each other, and that's all that campaign is. So we've had plenty of that, and I get that, and this is kind of the opposite of that, basically. This is something that, we still have dungeons. We still technically do have dungeons. But it just feels like we, for me at least, overcorrected a little bit to where I would have to push a little bit more dungeon crawly stuff in there and still have it make sense in the context of the Feywild, I think. But I think you could do that, and I still think the story is very cool. You learn about a little bit on the way. There's this little League of Malevolence that came in here, and one of their own betrayed them, and that's what kind of broke them apart. But then, and that's why, and the hags lost the unicorn horn, which is the big key, and that can be anywhere, and they live in fear of somebody coming in and stealing that horn and using that to change everything. But the Jabberwock is still loyal to the Feywild Queen, so that's why the hags can't actually like take over this castle, and they just all splintered off and did their own thing. So it kind of makes sense, but there's not really. It's just hags, right? Like, there's not a really good original BBEG, I guess, for this campaign, which is also disappointing. I think D&D doesn't do a good job of that in most of its campaigns in terms of creating actual cool villains that like appear again and again and instigate things and do stuff. In this case, it's a classic, like, no, but it's the Ravenloft domain thing where just there's a villain in charge of this domain is generally like, and it's not even the Strahd thing where the hag actually like shows up multiple times and harasses people. It's just they just sit there in their base, wait for the players to get to them, defeat them, and then move on to the next domain. And they basically rinse and repeat 3 times, which is very video gamey, until they get to the final, dungeon, essentially, which does have some fun stuff in it. There's a whole beanstalk you can, rise up in, and you get to deal with some of the League of Malevolence characters if you want to or not. You could just skip them and just make it to the end if you've got that unicorn horn. I think it's a fun campaign with what it does. I think it does a great job of doubling down on the phase stuff. It does feel like it's lacking in content a little bit because of the fact that it only goes up to level 8. and we don't get a whole lot of maps. I mean, the fact that this is a full $50 campaign and you're looking at all the maps you get. Now, the caveat being these are very big maps. This one right here, this is 30 rooms, and then we get to the top end of it and it goes up to like 50. These are huge rooms, and unfortunately they are 10-foot square maps, which, by the way, what Roll20 does, you can see this is a normal size token, so they literally subdivide the grids to make the tokens half the size, which is a bummer, but that does fix the problem. The other thing you can subdivide that further by putting actual grids in there, which is probably better. You can fix that the other way, which is to take this whole map and double the size of it, and that blows it up. So the tokens are the normal size, but the map is twice as huge. The problem is, A, you're probably going to lose a lot of the resolution quality by doubling it in size. B, that might make everybody's, chug a little bit when they're actually running it. And C, it's going to fuck up all your dynamic lighting. So dynamic lighting is something that's included in all the maps, which means when you're running through all these areas, everything is going to be blocked off, so it's going to create proper walls and doors and all those shenanigans. So if I wanted to let's see, move a character here, make sure they have some vision. We'll have to give them night vision in case there's no light in here. Alright, so now you can see I literally just lit that room up, but only according to the centaur, and I can hit Control L, and now you can see as if I was controlling the centaur. This is what the centaur would see right now. And you can see how the doors block it off, and then if I wanted to open this door, you go to dynamic lighting. This is why the doors are different lines, by the way, and then that opens the door, and all of a sudden now you can go out that way. This only works if you're a Roll20 subscriber, by the way, not for free members. You only get dynamic lighting if you actually subscribe and pay for Roll20, and then you get the dynamic lighting feature, which does look very cool, and I would absolutely recommend it if you are playing on Roll20 regularly. It looks very cool. Otherwise, you can use Fog of War, which is you have to draw boxes and stuff around manually, which I've done before that back in the day, and it was doable. So it's got all those nice bells and whistles. It just feels like it is lacking in content. I think the content that is there is very good, though. I think they do a great job with the story. They do a cool job with all the characters. There's just a lot of fun things to do in all these situations, and I think they actually absolutely nail that Feywild theme. Let's go over my pros and cons for a 40-minute review. I think that's about what I do for these the Roll20 reviews. They're big stuff, and I try to touch on everything that I can. Pro helpful Dungeon Master tips page for Roll20 users. That was that initial page I showed at the beginning. That's really awesome. I want to see that in all future Roll20 content that includes a whole campaign. Just a whole lot of really helpful features. If you're new, even if you're a returning person or you've been using it for years, I think there's really useful information to be had there. Pro, lovely isometric full color maps of the Witchlight Carnival and Prismeer Feywild Domain. I absolutely love region maps. I especially love well done region maps. They just excite me like nothing else. Good fantasy maps. I mean, it's that classic, you crack open the book and you see that first page and you're poring over like, oh, what does all this mean? Where's the adventure going to start? And and you flip back to that once you've realized what town we're starting in and all that. It's just fun. I love that. And you end up using these maps quite a bit, so it's a good thing that they're as good as they are. Pro, fun characters and interesting role-playing encounters. I really skimmed around a lot of it in the just to break up time, but there's a lot of really great. I mean, every single one of these locations is not really a dungeon crawl except for the hag layers, and even the hag layers, they got really fun. They all have little like minions that work for them. One of them is this like ghoul girl who wears a mask and is just super creepy. Like there's all kind. There's one of the hags can snip people's shadows away, so they come up with all these shadow creatures. There's a whole Peter Pan person basically that's a stand-in who's actually an Oni who was cursed, but they're reversed. Instead of lawful evil, they're chaotic good, and they became this like young heroic boy who, so if you ever do a remove curse on them, they turn back into their evil Oni. Lots of really cool fun ideas to be had, and that's to me what makes a good Feywild adventure, is really eccentric, crazy characters, but who aren't annoying, right? It like kind of toes that line between just being fun and memorable without being annoying and grating, which I guess part of that's up to the DM, but I feel like this adventure provides enough of those characters, most definitely. Pro, scripted random encounters tailored to each realm. I definitely went over that because that was something I wrote in my pro, but really great job at bringing these places to life, not necessarily by including these memorable locations on the map, but things that you encounter on the way. So it's really up to the DM to decide which ones to use, and all of them do a great job of really bringing that zone to life and creating interesting things to do that don't slow the action down by creating combat, which is such a great thing for an encounter to do. I feel like a video game can get away with that because you're just playing, you're going through combat pretty quickly and you kind of expect that. But for D&D, if you have combat random encounters, they really have to kind of mean something, or maybe you're just running a grimdark, resource-driven survival campaign, because it really kind of slows the action down versus getting to some place where the actual dungeon stuff matters. And plus, there's the whole, problem with long resting and getting back your resources. So what does the random encounter matter and all that thing? So I think having scripted encounters that aren't combat is extremely good, and they do a great job of bringing all these different realms to life. And large, richly themed dungeons for each hag. I was hugely I was initially very shocked at the low amount of maps, and I thought, oh, I'm going to hate this. Even though the map quality is great, there's not a lot going on. But then I actually went through all the dungeons, and I was like, okay, there's not a lot of dungeons, but the ones that are here are very well done. There's a lot to do. There's all these different, it really kind of checks that exploration itch that I had. Even though you're technically exploring these realms, because it's the DM throwing things at you, it doesn't feel like you're necessarily really exploring as the player. To me, that real explorer pillar comes from being in a dungeon and choosing, I'm going to go this way, I'm going to interact with this thing, I'm going to do that. I'm going to go this path, versus if you're on a map and you're just going along, then it's up to the DM to trigger all the stuff. So you're not really making those choices anymore. I guess you can make a choice of which location to go to, obviously, but the DM is then going to trigger, well, I'm going to trigger this at you no matter what. This is the first encounter. So I am glad that the dungeons are large. They give you a lot of those options, and they do a great job telling little mini stories with all these NPCs inside the dungeons. And if you wanted to, you could probably turn them into a room-to-room combat encounter. Most of them aren't necessarily set up for that, but it would also, on the other hand, it would be hard to actually avoid combat in all of these areas too. I think they while they do advertise this as technically you could do a pacifist run, similar to video games like Skyrim and stuff, I do think it would be very challenging to do that. It would be something that DM would have to be on board for and really hold back and give the players a lot of safety net to be able to do that, because there are some tricky situations to try to avoid combat completely. You can probably guess my cons, which are, I think it lacks in content compared to other full price adventures. The fact that it only goes from level 1 to 8. The fact that we only get a few dungeons, which leads into my second con, that only the hag layers in the final dungeon are actually mapped. So for Roll20 purposes, all of these different areas, all you have are the character handouts. You don't have any kind of map tokens to work with or anything. So you're going to spend a lot of time on these region maps until you actually get to those hag layers. And then you actually get to do the dungeon crawl thing. So in terms of adapting it to Roll20, it doesn't quite work and maybe that's a problem that I'm more biased towards actually dungeon crawling, because I play a lot of my stuff via Roll20. So anything that doesn't have a lot of maps is a little bit of a bummer to me, even though the maps are very, very, very good, and I love the quality of those few dungeons that we do get. Final verdict: by effectively focusing on fantastical worlds and eccentric characters, the Wild Beyond the Witchlight provides a narrative-rich, fish-out-of-water adventure, though its lack of maps, dungeons, and higher-tier content is ultimately disappointing. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Christopher, Thomas, Captain Mike, Adam, Stan, Nathan, Alex, Cam, William, and I'm Loud. And gold patrons: RPG Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, David, Marcus, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam Ross, Limpy Spuds, Jerome, Sclenny, Nick, Party Mick, Butterpants, Blood Angel, Vornus, Babin, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, and James. You know I've been talking way too long when I screw up the Patreon credits I've been saying for so long. Thank you all very much for your support.